Thank you for joining the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Houston for our weekly online Ministers Forum. I'm the Reverend Dr. Colin Bossen, Senior Minister of the congregation. These programs are conversations with community organizers, scholars, religious leaders, and others about how we can collectively address the present crisis. Their purpose is to offer members of our community and all who wish to join us online science-based resources and liberation-oriented inspiration to get us through these difficult times. Today I'm joined by Marianne Garneau. She is an organizer in New York City with the Industrial Workers of the World. She's been involved in workplace, tenant, and student organizing for 15 years and currently teaches in the Labor Studies program at the City University of New York and runs the website organizing.work. For those of you who are with us for the first time, let me say a few words about Unitarian Universalism. We are a religious tradition that celebrates the possibility of goodness within each human heart, the transformative power of love, and the clarifying force of reason. We believe that we need not think alike to love alike. We hope that you find these forums a source of connection, hope, and clarity. Marianne, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So I wonder if you could just start out by talking about why labor organizing is so important.
I think it's important because most of us are working people. Most of us have to work in order to support ourselves and our families, and we spend a lot of time at work. And work is not a place of empowerment. In fact, it's a place of a lot of bullying and mistreatment. It's a place where we have little control over our lives and over ourselves and over our futures. And the only remedy for that really is for workers to come together and stand with each other in solidarity and take collective action to improve things for themselves.
So I wonder if you could sort of talk a little bit about that last point, collective action, and kind of what that looks like and what's that mean. I know that you've been an organizer, for instance, of a labor union called the Stardust Family United, and you've had some success working with them to win some significant economic gains and some gains around respect at the workplace with those workers. So could you kind of talk a little bit about what that's been like?
Sure. So that is one of the campaigns I've been involved with here in New York, one of the bigger ones. They are workers at a restaurant called Ellen's Stardust Diner, which is like a tourist famous destination in Times Square. And it's the place where the waiters not only serve you, but they also sing. They sing Broadway tunes and pop songs and jazz standards and whatever, and they kind of float between working in the theater world and then coming back to the diner in between work in theater. And they approached us about 3 or 4 years ago, 4 years ago now, because management was bullying them, management was firing a lot of staff, mistreating them, intimidating them, not maintaining a safe work environment. And what they have learned to do is they've built a way to basically communicate with each other. They have what we would call a committee, but really almost every worker in the workplace will communicate when there's an issue, and then they will formulate a plan of direct action to take on that issue. So one of the simple examples is that there's a stage that they stand on. It's actually a long double-sided booth or banquette that runs the length of the restaurant, and it was rickety and unstable, and a couple workers had fallen off and injured themselves because they have to get up and down this thing all day. And when they had asked management to fix it, management had refused, for whatever reason, without giving a reason. And so they eventually just collectively decided not to get up on this banquette stage anymore, and that's when the employer finally fixed it. So it's them really kind of learning how to exercise their power that they have in the workplace by virtue of being workers in order to get their needs met and get their demands met.
So could you talk a little bit more about kind of what's necessary to build this kind of power in a workplace?
The necessary thing is really trust and good bonds of solidarity with your fellow coworkers. And that's, it's kind of like a light switch. If you switch it on, if you suddenly can take collective action, you actually generally will win in the workplace. Bosses need you to keep working more than you need them to boss you around. But the difficulty is forming those kinds of relationships that are strong enough so that when the time comes to take that action, because it is risky and it's scary, and it's very out of the ordinary from the way that we usually operate at work. It's confrontational, it's empowered, it's democratic. It kind of goes against all of the instincts that we are groomed to have as workers, where we passively accept what is given to us. To build enough strength and solidarity with your coworkers to do that really requires creating trust with them. I mean, trust that they will have your back when things get kind of hot. Trust that they won't back out at the last minute. Trust that they will act in solidarity and not try to kind of individually cut a better deal for themselves. And so think of what it takes for you to feel that kind of solidarity or bond with somebody else, with anybody, with a neighbor, with a friend. It takes a lot of relationship building.
So I think that that's a really interesting sort of framework to think about it as a relationship, and that you're working on relationship building. And as you know, I've been involved in organizing, worker organizing, for a very long time, although not so much currently in my current capacity, but certainly prior to this position as senior minister here. And I think that that point of relationship is really almost like the crucial point, in that you're trying to, when workers come together to organize, they're actually creating new kinds of relationships with each other that can, well, I mean, just reframes the way that they relate to their employers, right? So, like, if you come into a workplace, you primarily have a sort of relationship with your employer. And by trying to engage in workers organizing or workplace organizing, you're actually trying to shift that relationship from the employer to between the other workers.
The reason why there's as much, abuse and the exploitation is kind of baked into work, right? You only get to work and make a wage and make a living for yourself and feed your family and put a roof over your head as long as you keep the boss happy, the company happy, and so on. So it's a relationship of exploitation and very uneven power relationship right there. But the reason why there's as much abuse and mistreatment at work is because of the hierarchical kind of arrangement, right? The boss says what goes, and you generally have to listen. When you organize with your coworkers, you can actually just turn that relationship on its head. And there was this moment early on in that campaign that struck me where we were having a very large meeting of like 30 or 40 workers, and we were going around doing introductions. And this is at the diner. And everybody was saying, oh, I'm happy to work at this place. I'm proud to work at this place. And then it finally came around to this one young woman, and she said, to be honest, I have never been that proud to work at this place. It was where I landed instead of getting a Broadway gig, and I, not deeply ashamed of it, but I wasn't super proud to be here. And she said, now that, this is very early on in the union, she said, now that we have this union effort going and that we are taking action and standing up for ourselves, I'm so proud to be here. I leave my uniform on when I leave work so that people can see me wearing it and that they know that I'm associated with this place. And that's the, I think, power of organizing, is that it flips that power relationship with your boss on its head, and then also kind of just transforms work from this place of alienation to a place of empowerment.
So I think along those lines, or maybe not quite along those lines, you're an advocate of something called solidarity unionism, which really, I think, focuses on this kind of transformation of relationship and the development of relationships between working people to look after themselves. And I'm wondering if you could sort of talk about solidarity unionism as contrasted with, I mean, the technical term for it is often either business union or labor contractualism, which is probably too fancy of a term, but other kind of sort of the organizing that is often pursued by more mainstream unions, like, for example, the United Auto Workers.
So in a typical union, the employees will reach out to a union, and an organizer will come in and they will organize underground for a while. So without trying to let the boss know. And what they'll do in that period is get people to sign what are called authorization cards. And if the union can collect enough of these authorization cards that authorize the union to bargain on behalf of workers, then generally speaking, there will be an election. If the union wins the election by a majority, 50% plus one, then the union is legally certified to bargain on behalf of those workers with the employer. And the employer is legally obligated to come to a bargaining table and sit down and negotiate. They're not legally obligated to give you anything, however. And unions have been finding over the last 40 years especially that the 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 way that the formal legal framework works is less and less for working people and more for businesses. It's not as empowering as it used to be to the extent that it ever was, because you've got a lot of constraints on what workers are allowed to do in that process. The solidarity union approach instead really kind of taps into the insight that the power that workers have lies in the fact that they are the ones who are serving pancakes, teaching students, building widgets in a factory, what have you. They're the ones who are actually making the work happen and making the product happen, making the service happen. And if they can learn how to collectively, put their foot on the brake and withhold their labor or modify how they're doing their labor or advance certain demands, then they can win. And so solidarity unionism cuts to the chase and kind of sidesteps the legal process a little bit, which is perfectly legal in itself, right? You don't have to use that formal official process. And it just has workers basically talk to each other, form committees, form these democratic structures for making decisions, and then take that direct action. And it's been very effective. So I'll give a few other examples just to illustrate. One of the things that they won was the employer wanted them to learn a new musical number for New Year's Eve. And this would have taken a tremendous amount of time on their part. And the 8 people who were supposed to work that shift talked to each other and said, do we really want to do this? We'd be taking time out of our lives over the busy holiday season in order to work essentially for free, because we'd be learning this piece on our own time outside of work when we're not serving. And they took a vote and they decided that they didn't want to do that. And so they turned around and told the employer that kind of like the night before. And there was nothing the employer could do about it. And because they are organized and the employer knows that they have each other's backs, there was no retaliation for that either. And so everything they've done has been a matter of basically putting forward a demand and then backing it up with collective action, especially having to do with withholding their labor. They've been more effective in the horizon of this 4 years that they've been doing this than most standard campaigns would ever be in that same amount of time. So they've won at this point a long list of things, including raises and new equipment and new like health and safety issues and infrastructure and whatever, that if you were to sit down with an employer across a bargaining table, especially for a first contract, when you kind of barely wrestle out some language acknowledging that the union exists and has a right to be there, they would never have gotten what they've gotten sitting down at a table with the employer. They've gotten it just through their direct action.
So you're talking about this model of organizing, solidarity unionism, contrasting it with sort of traditional, well, it's not really traditional, but the sort of more establishment unions. And you're a labor journalist. You've got this great website, Organizing.work, which we'll talk about in a little bit. I'm curious if you have sort of thoughts on the future of labor organizing during this time because of the pandemic and just perhaps in general.
I think that I think that you put it well in one of your sermons where you talk about how these are apocalyptic times, and what apocalypse means in Greek is kind of unveiling or laying bare. And I think that what the coronavirus crisis has done is really kind of lay bare the conditions that exist. So how much we depend on, for example, grocery store workers or sanitation workers or people who we don't pay particularly well and don't particularly give a lot of social status to. But at the same time, there are forces on the other side that are doing their best to use the kind of tightened state budgets and the austerity in order to strip workers of rights, strip immigrants of rights, and kind of continue their attack on the working class. So unfortunately, There's nothing about a pandemic per se that makes it any easier to organize. I've collected stories, however, of workers doing amazing things where they have taken collective action and won things like hazard pay or health and safety outside of the usual very slow moving framework of bargaining across a table. And they've won it in a short amount of time in these very urgent times. I've also collected stories, unfortunately, of companies, even nonprofit companies, stepping up their union busting and using the pandemic as a pretext, like, hey, we all have to come together. Now is not the time for a union. And of course, at the same time, the company's not providing them with with personal protective equipment. It's not taking care of their health properly. So that really is kind of a lie that comes from bosses that unions are something we should set aside for now. So, you know, the formula is the same, which is that you have to build trust and solidarity with your coworkers in order to be able to take that collective action. It doesn't mean that it's any faster because it gets back to what we were talking about before, where this is ultimately about developing a relationship with someone. And that's something that you can do, but you can't necessarily expedite too much.
So does, in your opinion, I mean, you've written about this actually, about how there's no shortcuts to organizing, and that particular times may or may not be sort of more ripe for organizing. I mean, do you think that like there's some the advent of some kind of crisis like the pandemic necessarily changes the possibilities that people have for organizing?
I think that any crisis kind of throws things up in the air a little bit, but the motivations that are there, that were already there, are still in play. And the workers that I've seen be most successful during the pandemic have been ones who were already organized. So they either had a union or they had a union campaign going. And that includes the solidarity unions where there's no official formal structure, um, simply because they'd already taken those initial steps. I'm certainly not saying it can't be done in a place that hasn't started, but even if you do kind of start from zero today, working under these conditions, the steps are basically going to be the same, which is that you have to develop trust with your coworkers. And I've seen workers pull off wins fairly quickly. Um, Bosses are not used to workers saying no. And when you can actually get a group of workers to do that, like to something, saying no to something that's unacceptable to them, right? Or demanding something that they want, if you can get a really broad group of workers to do that, so most of the workers in a workplace, let's say, or all of the workers on a given shift, or a big sizable chunk of the workplace, then it does tend to work because it is really terrifying to employers because they know that they depend on workers in order for their business or nonprofit or school or hospital or whatever to function. Um, but then sometimes, because it's such an emotionally charged thing to take that kind of action, and we're not used to doing it as workers, there's a lot of nerves involved. And afterwards, bosses can kind of manipulate that situation to their advantage and say, okay, I'll reach out to this group and say, let's be friends, and I'll give that guy a promotion, and I will maybe marginalize that one troublemaker, or I'll give them a raise, or whatever. So it's kind of the same cat and mouse game that is always happening under a pandemic as in ordinary times.
And so, for people who are trying to organize their workplace, I feel like what you're suggesting is maybe that the most important relationship they have is with each other, and that they try not to let themselves be divided.
Absolutely. And that's important to underscore because the temptation a lot of the time is to think, well, this is illegal, or, this is unsafe. This is just morally outrageous. And there's a temptation also to think that if only people knew this terrible thing that was happening, there would be public outcry and the boss would be embarrassed and they would have to change their ways. And from what I have seen as an organizer, that doesn't really play out. Bosses get away with really egregious things and illegal things because they know that they can.
So, you're sort of saying, in some sense, that the best protection people have at work is actually each other, not some kind of legal framework. And I think that you and I have talked in the past about kind of how that plays out with people in the gig economy. And I'm wondering if you kind of offer us some reflections on sort of the gig economy, how it relates to solidarity unionism, and how it relates to kind of legal frameworks for workers' rights. And I may interject here a little bit because, as you know, I organized what now would be called a gig economy union called the Chicago Couriers Union a number of years ago that touches on a lot of these issues. So, or helped organize. Anyways, wasn't organized, therefore.
This is the thing is that, the gig work and app-based work is kind of also part of the cat and mouse game. It's another way that capitalism basically has found to kind of hide the fact that workers work collectively. So unless you have a number of workers performing the same task, you don't really have a business. And these new apps like Uber or the food delivery ones or what have you, kind of camouflage the employee relationship. So it's like, oh, I just sign into an app when I want some work and I pick up a bit of work and I don't have an employer. And they also camouflage who your coworkers are. And that is done intentionally. It's done for the sheer reason of making it difficult to organize. Because again, if the one power that workers have in this capitalist economy is the fact that they have each other and work is collective, and if they can wield that collective power, they can win demands and reverse the power relationship a bit with the boss. Then all of the new kind of independent contractor, freelance, gig work, app-based work is trying to destroy and undermine that. It's trying to prevent you from being able to build solidarity with your coworkers by not letting you know who they are in the first place. And in response to that, unions have sometimes taken a stance that this is hopeless, or they've taken a stance that we need to regulate this kind of work first before we attempt to organize it, because if these workers are classified as independent contractors and not actual employees, then we legally can't organize them or collect dues from them or whatever. So this is a way that there's been this innovation in order to kind of outsmart or maneuver around organized labor. But it, to me, is also an instance that shows, as you're suggesting, that the solidarity union approach, where you basically just find all those workers and say, forget about what we can legally certify, let's start taking collective action. And the challenges are very significant in trying to just locate people, but it can be done, and I've published stories on the website too, not necessarily with the solidarity unionism model, of like collecting all of the food delivery workers in a city just through incredibly imaginative organizing efforts, waiting outside of restaurants, having 30-second phone conversations with people where you get their phone number, asking them for the names of other people, like looking for who's wearing a uniform for that delivery company and pulling them over and asking them a question. So it can be done.
Yeah. Well, and I guess one thing that I might highlight here, just in terms of the whole conversation about independent contractors and app-based work, is that just because people's employers are classifying them as independent contractors doesn't mean they actually are independent contractors. And like that was something that when I was organizing in transit, Chicago Couriers Union and then truckers and taxi drivers at various points, was frequently the case. People would be told by their employers that they were independent contractors, and the IRS would be like, no, you're an employee. You should be getting a W-2. Or the unemployment office would be like, well, just because your employer is saying you're an independent contractor, it turns out you meet all of these tests that say you're actually an employee, because all of these different federal agencies have all sorts of different criteria that say, are around things like you are able to determine your work. Like, can you refuse a job? Can you direct jobs? Can you, choose amongst different choices? Can you, is a certain percentage of your work coming from one employer? So I think that, that is also important in this conversation, is that, like, just because the employer says it's so does not actually mean that it is so.
It's true, and then it's also kind of difficult to challenge this on a legal basis too. So one thing I didn't know until I first of all, almost every group of workers that I talk to these days, there's some misclassification as independent contractors, and that includes, fitness instructors or like just all kinds of people that you would least expect. I'm trying to not name workers that I'm organizing with because not all the campaigns are kind of public yet. Um, but and then the employers will pull this kind of fast logic. Well, they'll simultaneously say that these workers are independent contractors, and also tell them, by the way, don't go work anywhere else for the competition, and try to restrict them with a non-compete clause, which is funny because it's like I'm either working independently or I'm not, right? And what turns out to be the case, though, is that there's no direct way of challenging the fact that you're misclassified, right? You can't just appeal to the labor board. You can't just kind of solve that through the IRS. In order to actually change your relationship with your employer on a legal level, there's no obvious path to do that. And but there are two instances where I've helped workers basically throw that to the wind, say forget about who's a W-2 employee and who is a 1099 independent contractor. Let's organize everyone together and take collective action. In one case, got their demand met, right? They didn't want this non-compete clause, and sure enough, it got taken off the table by the employer. In the other case, they actually won reclassification, where they're all employees now, and that entitled them to things like healthcare benefits and or paid sick time in New York State and that kind of thing. So again, even in the case of a technical legal matter, it turns out that collective action is kind of the best approach, at least in some cases anyway.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that that's very generally true. I think that maybe the thing that I would, I don't want to say differ with you on, but like just try to pull out here is that with independent contractors, there's lots of different agencies.
Well, and I think that the other broader lesson is that the law should not be like either a constraint or limit on what workers expect for themselves, and nor should we expect legal processes to deliver results very quickly. So, a couple of examples at Stardust Diner, the new minimum wage in New York State had just gone into effect, and it constituted a raise of a couple dollars an hour, especially for people who work in what we call the back of house, so in the kitchen, dishwashers, cooks. And they didn't like the wage compression that came with that, so now they were all making the same amount, whether you were a dishwasher who started a few weeks ago or a top line cook or something like that. And so they 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 did a sit down strike like we've read about happening in the 30s and 40s and 50s, and they demanded a $1.50 raise for people at the sort of lower end of the food chain and a $2.50 raise for people at the upper end of the food chain, and they won. They did it with two sit down strikes, and like these are like migrant workers. These are workers we're not used. We often think of as, oh, it's too risky for them to take action. And who may have like kind of circumscribed access to legal rights and legal recourse in the first place, but they were able to win that. Um, my other legal example is that in the case of the Ellen's campaign, the Stardust Family United campaign, when they went public with their union, there was a mass firing. The employer fired 15 people in the course of a week, and then another 16 people in a single day. And we challenged those at the Labor Relations Board. And that case took a year to grind through the courts, basically, before it was finally determined that these people were illegally fired for organizing. But even our lawyer, very, very talented labor lawyer who fought on our behalf, said, like, the thing that carried the day is that you just never stopped organizing. Like, the employers know that that kind of thing is illegal, but they do it anyway because they figure whatever penalties I'm going to face, and they're not huge. It's like, you have to offer that person their job back, or you owe them a bit of back pay. Whatever penalties I'm going to face are worth it to get rid of the union. But those workers were just completely relentless in all of the action that they took in order to keep pressure and keep organizing the people who were hired to replace them. And that's ultimately the thing that carried the day. And so, yeah, the law is available, but as I like to say, it's not a lightning bolt that comes down from the sky to rectify injustice or violations of the law.
So we are running out of time, and I thought that I would end, there we go, by asking you to tell us a bit about organizing work. what is it, and what you do with it.
So it has sort of two related missions, and one of them is to let workers talk about their organizing efforts from their own perspective. It could be a solidarity unionism campaign, it could be a mainstream union campaign. But there's very little amplification of worker voices and workers' perspectives in those things. Nowadays, unions are extremely tightly controlled in their communications and in who they allow to talk to the press. And it's for somewhat understandable strategic reasons because they don't want anything getting out that the boss could possibly use against the union. But unions also tend to really kind of like shut down communication too much and over rely on good public presentation. The second related reason that the blog exists then is just to kind of really talk about union organizing and union strategy in a kind of honest, strikes and gutters, what works, what doesn't work kind of approach, because the erosion of labor journalism in general has meant that there's less labor reporting overall, and the stuff that does exist tends to be very cheerleading and very positive, which again I'm politically on side with, but it's hard for workers to learn from that if they can't really see what decisions are being made and how and what worked and what didn't. And so in a way it fits with that solidarity unionism approach of trying to kind of democratize organizing and democratize unions and sort of put it back in workers' hands themselves and give them some direct knowledge and control over it again.
So I would just like to recommend the website to anybody who's listening to this or watching this. I mean, I think it is, from my money, one of the best. In my opinion.
And you are a subscriber.
Yes, so I guess anyways, but the point is that it is I think one of the best sources for labor news around, and incredibly insightful as I've found this conversation to be. And also it's just a place where you get stories and people's perspectives that you're just not going to get anywhere else. And one of the things that I think I find interesting about it as somebody who does, organizing in congregational contexts and organizing in community organizing contexts. I mean, I'm working with the Metropolitan Organization here in Houston right now, is that so many of the sort of stories and perspectives you have or you publish from working folk about their struggles at workplaces really translate in different contexts to anyone who's interested in building a democratic organization in any context. And so I think that that's a really, the focus is on workplace organizing, but if you're interested in community organizing, you're interested in thinking about how to build a democratic church, it is really a wonderful resource for those things. I don't normally engage in this kind of boosterism at the end of these things, but it is just a great resource for people, and I hope that you'll all turn to that.
I really appreciate that. So to clarify, the URL is odd. It's organizing.work. And not dot anything else.
Right,
but
right.
I appreciate the very kind words.
Well, thank you very much, Marianne, for joining us, and thank you to all of our members and viewers for tuning in. I hope that you'll tune in next week when we will be talking with Diana Strausman of Rice University about feminist economics. If you found this video to be helpful, I hope you will consider joining us for our weekly worship service. It's posted online each Sunday at 10:30 a.m. Central Standard Time, and this week we're featuring a special service led by women in the congregation. Thank you to our staff for making this video possible. It was produced by Christian Holmes. Alma Viscara assisted with the editing. We'll see you all online soon and in person as soon as it's possible for us to gather again. And please remember that no matter how isolated you feel, we are all in this together.